We saw in COVID a whole lot of fruit and vegetables rotting on the ground everywhere because we couldn't get enough people there. We desperately need more automation in agriculture, aquaculture. But we cannot do that because we cannot see behind the leaves. There's no point getting a robot to harvest 85, 90% of the fruit. You might as well get humans to do it because you're losing too much profit. So the big challenge here is, how do we see behind the leaves? How do we see what is normally unseen? What type of AI research do we need to do in this case? So I'll start off first talking about one of the projects we recently got, a $6 million MB project last year. And the goal is to have a whole lot of cameras going along both sides of the vines, getting hundreds and hundreds of images and integrating them together to get a really high quality 3D point cloud, and then from that recognise all the plant organs like buds, flowers, fruit from the minute they start growing and so on. So that was the goal of it, was for yield estimation, but the real goal of this is in the last two words of this, more automation. Like, how do we enable more automation? And we can't enable more automation of something we can't see. So that was the cunning plan behind this whole grant, which was really focused on yield estimation, because you have to have some reasonable commercialisation goal for any project that we do. So we've got very high resolution, so 6 12 megapixel cameras and on a pole going along. We are trying to come up with growth estimates because we have seen all the organs, the flowers, the buds, everything. We've got the exact metrics for them down to the millimetre, and then we are working with biologists who are doing like physiological growth models to predict any bits we can't see. We know how big it should be, and so on, and a bit of clever, I call it sort of like deep fake stuff of little bits of the plants we can't see, where we can see one side and not the other, and so on. So it's been a really challenging research project. We're fortunate to have hit the ground running from another big Auckland-based Maratech project that Bruce McDonald headed, and basically continuing with that research. So step one, of course, is to survey the whole vineyard. And so first you need to know where it needs to go, like an autonomous lawnmower. You know, it needs to know where it needs to go. Want to capture a whole lot of images with perfect focus, always the same distance, perfect lighting, not going too fast, there's not motion blur, so not raining, of course, not too windy. So there's a whole lot of constraints when, as a photographer, you're trying to take the perfect image. And we're moving up to 12 megapixel cameras on the stem at different angles and so on. So just stepping through this, so here's just in vineyards alone, so we're looking at orchards, and cherry orchards, apple orchards and so on. But, you know, we have to hand prune, you know, so many vines, and this is only 0.5% of the world production, and every year we have the problem in the middle of winter. Kiwis don't want to get frostbitten fingers pruning vines, so what do? We get Pacific Islanders over from the lovely warm Pacific Islanders so they can get frostbitten fingers pruning vines. So, so clearly it is something that we need to automate, because you should never prune in the rain, but they're so short of pruners that for the last number of years we've been pruning in the rain, because the rain washes disease into the cut points. So here's an example of a little robot, sort of like a 1 metre robot, trundling along with a row of cameras on, so fairly simple, and you can imagine that with a robot arm doing the pruning. So, you know, step one is to figure out what the path is, because the last thing you want to do is to be manually controlling this. You want it just to autonomously go up and down. So from, you know, Google Earth and a whole bunch of other sources, we can get automatically translate those into the layout of vineyards and so on, and end up with an online database which can potentially be petabytes when you're doing huge vineyards, because you've got so many images. And the whole project is really, you could think of it as a data reduction exercise, how to reduce petabytes of data down to just 3D models of every plant. So looking at the processing workflow, the data processing, first of all, we want to get a whole lot of images, and then we want to do 3D reconstruction, and after we've done 3D reconstruction, one of the hardest challenges in AI is from that lovely point cloud that we can cognitively interpret when we look at it and we can spin it around. We know what a vine is, we know what a bud is, we know what a grape or apple is, but we're doing that interpretation. How do we, from a 3D point cloud, automatically develop the deep learning frameworks to recognise all those 3D structures? So a lot of people have done 2D work, and we still need a lot more effort to be put into the 3D labelling of like organs and so on plants. So big problems are harsh lighting, bright sunlight, harsh shadows, wind, a whole bunch of things. So we've gone for a high definition, high dynamic range camera, and you end up looking at little tendrils and wires up to 1 millimetre thick. And we tried stereo because, let's face it, most of our lives here we've been playing with stereo for 3D reconstruction and using that approach. The trouble is with stereo, if you have something that thin, it could just be a few pixels across, and there's really big depth discontinuities in most plants between the plant you're looking at in the background, and those depth discontinuities means a whole lot of depth errors along the edges, which means your whole vine is just a whole lot of depth errors, which makes 3D approach, the normal stereo approach, not useful. So we've had to look at some current deep learning approaches, which is great. So, but we did try the whole stereo matching. We pushed it to the limits with all the latest research just to see how good we could go. And, you know, it looks pretty good at a glance, but then when you look closely, you can see all the breaks in the vines, and it's just garbage in, garbage out. You can't make good pruning decisions if most of your vines have breaks in them and there's no continuity. So we looked at NERF last year, Gaussian splatting this year, probably next year will be something else, and these are making really big progress in taking hundreds and hundreds of images of very fine structures like plants and coming up with a very good high quality point cloud of very thin structures, which is brilliant. So, you know, here's the neuroradiance fields we've done some extensions because you can't just circle around with a camera a big row of vines. You have to go along one side and then down the other side, and then you have to figure out how to align those images and make sure they are pretty closely aligned for the plant. So there's, you know, with GPS, RTK, you can get within centimetres of each side with the images, so you know roughly where you are on each side of the plant. Because if you imagine a cylinder, you're on one side and you're looking at the cylinder on the other side, there is nothing in common. There are no pixels in common. So, so you sort of have this problem of alignment and making sure you've done a good job. So we've done a few approaches with zero NERF to solve this, so some innovations to the NERF approach of generating 3D point clouds. Excuse me, going fairly fast through this, I realise we don't have a lot of time before lunch. So, of course, there's an iterative approach, you know, with getting the alignment correct and minimising the errors and so on, as you'd expect, and to minimise global drift so we don't go, you know, from one end of a row half a kilometre to the other end. We use chunks like the posts, the vines between posts, because posts are nice and reliable things that don't move from scan to scan, and then all we're looking at is like a row of 4 vines, and so you get very minimal drift. So you can see it gives a very nice high quality 3D point cloud, actually seeing all the tiny little tendrils, the thinnest parts of the vine that are clinging onto the wires. So here's an example using NERF, and this is what gave us the confidence that we can solve this problem of seeing the unseen. Because this looks like a camera just scanning around an apple tree. It is not. This is just a 3D model of the apple tree, and we're just rendering different viewpoints of this model. And you can see that, you know, we can actually get to the point of seeing right behind the leaves and so on. And as I mentioned before, this was with hundreds and hundreds of images from each side of the apple tree, because a lot of these orchards are starting to trellis like vineyards now, where they're 2D trellising. So it makes it a bit easier to see everything when you have hundreds of images from one side, hundreds of images from the other. The cameras are really close, so, and wide angle, so they're within sort of about 3/4 to half a metre wide angle, so you can see under the leaves that way, under the leaves that way as you're going along. Under the leaves from looking underneath and from above looking down. So you've got really wide viewpoints to integrate. So this is just sort of giving a bit of a feel for how well it did work, and then looking at how many camera images we've got. So you can sort of see these hundreds of camera viewpoints that we had of the plant to achieve this. So state of the art is Metashape. It does usually do a really good job on the left, and here's our NERF approach on the right. As you can see, the Metashape sort of confused a bit of cloud pixels, didn't quite get the colour right, whereas with NERF we're doing a way better job than even the latest off-the-shelf state-of-the-art approach. What was interesting was, oops, shouldn't have done that, sorry. See if I can pause it. Just looking for something. Somewhere there, here's a spider web somewhere, which, there it is. So see that spider web there? That really vindicated my goal, which has always been a bit humorous with my various research teams, is the goal of 0.1 millimetre resolution, 3D resolution. Because underwater, that's the level you need to differentiate between bad invasive biofouling species and good ones, and for detecting disease and so on. So when I saw this, which was a bit of a surprise with Gaussian splattering, it sort of made me, look, if we're seeing a spider web, we must be getting pretty close to 0.1 millimetre resolution. So I was really excited by that. So we are getting there to the level that we need to be. So of course, now we've got this perfect 3D point cloud. How do we segment it? How do we say, okay, there's the woody leafy structures, how do we skeletonize it? How do we find all the organs and label everything on the entire plant and give the actual measurements, like sub-millimetre accurate measurements, because that's what they'll need to do way more accurate prediction of yield. At the moment, they're 20% out, and when they're starting to look at their yield, and that costs them millions of dollars to be that far out. It's the same in forestry. When they do a stock take of the trees, they're about 20% out. Imagine running a business, and when you do your stock take, you're 20% out. You're really not going to make much profit if your estimates are that bad. So, there's a whole lot of ways of doing skeletonization. I was really surprised that none of them worked really well, I suppose because we've got branches which are touching other branches and overlapping, which is a bit of a pain. So we've had to come up with innovating a few different approaches to skeletonization along plants. One thing is that plants are very nice structures, tend to be fairly hierarchical in how thin the branches are and so on, which is useful. And of course we train a lot on synthetic data before we actually go to real data and start skeletonizing the real data. And as I said, constantly innovating different approaches for skeletonization of this kind of data. So this is using the Gaussian splatting for a tree in the Christchurch Botanical Gardens, and did an astoundingly good job, and that sort of shows you all the camera angles. So this is just like walking around, it's not even flying a drone around. We also did try it flying a drone around as well, but a lot of places you can't fly drones over people's heads and near people, so it's not always so practical. So as I said, our goal is to be getting really down to millimetre accuracy, to give very accurate volumes, because one of the things we have to do is not just look at alignment both sides, but looking at alignment 2 weeks later. Have we perfectly aligned it? How much did everything grow? What is the increase in volume? If we're doing sub-millimetre accuracy, we need to know things like this. So there's a whole lot of things we need to be looking at. We need better human animation tools for labelling 3D. We need to handle wind, because we can only, the leaves, so actually surprising how much the leaves can move a little bit, and even though you're taking images with the leaf moving, I'm amazed that they actually do reconstruct perfectly okay, until you get too much wind, and then it all turns to custard. So yeah, and then another $10 million project we're working on is looking at drones, which typically state-of-the-art hover about plus or minus a centimetre or so, and our goal is to, a big hairy aspirational goal, get it down to hovering within a millimetre or so, to use tools and so on. Go to Bunnings, don't buy the scaffolding and ladder, just buy the drone attachment for your drill and so on, and yeah, so that's the big goal. But there's a whole lot of other applications where we don't really need the millimetre control, like pruning branches of pine trees, pruning power lines. So this is one of our early ones, pruning branches. So this is working completely autonomously with someone running around the background with their hand on emergency stop button, because this is research code, and at any moment the code could do something terrible and pole drive the cutting tool into that person's face the other side of the net. So you really do want to be a little bit careful about health and safety when you're playing with things like this. Sorry. Now here's a drone just pruning catkins. Don't have to hear the volume. Oh, there it is. So, so it's just recognising all the catkins and autonomously pruning. What was interesting was, I'll just go to the next slide because of that annoying noise. I should turn the sound off. Is that when you get a human to do it, it's actually really hard. Even the best pilots need about 6 goes to get it lined up. Whereas the minute you do autonomous navigation, it just goes straight for it and cuts it perfectly. Of course, one of the problems is you're outdoors. We're assuming visual odometry works because all our research on visual odometry assumes all the points we're looking at are static, whether you're driving cars along the road. There might be big objects that are moving, but a lot of the context of your scenery is static until you're outside working closely with trees and that, and suddenly all your points are moving. So, it sort of like destroys visual odometry. So we had to come up with some new visual odometry approaches to account for this. And even pruning something simple like a pine tree. I can't think of anything simpler than a pine tree. It's a cylinder with circles of cylinders coming out of it. Like, how hard can it be to find the exact cut point where you want to cut, where that red is? And it's fascinating with all these different projects. It's like a decade or so for us to get to the level where we have enough knowledge and experience to overcome our naivety and overcome the complexity and have something working reliably. So that's taking way longer than I thought it would. Just finishing up, because it's time for me to finish the talk, is underwater mussel farms. Unlike other agriculture where you can walk around the fences, kick the fence posts, look at them and so on, your entire farm is underwater and invisible. So it would be great if you could just have an underwater drone, and that's what we've developed. We throw it in the water, within minutes it just scans up and down a mussel rope, comes back and gives you the count of the mussels, the size of them, biofouling that's growing on them, and so on. So here's an example of it, going down with one underwater drone watching another one, and you can sort of see how it just scans down the rope, and it's really good visibility most of the time. Like if its turbidity is too high, obviously it's not going to work. The water's full of turbidity, but most of the time the turbidity is fairly good. And so, of course, we've trained it on a whole lot of different green mussels, blue mussels, a whole lot of different marine organisms that grow on mussels, and then coming up with more and more clever ways to get more accurate sizing of the mussels that we are finding. So, and forever, like everyone here, experimenting with different architectures to see if we can always come up with something that's better than what's out there. And of course, one of the things they want is to grab samples, so we've also come up with a way just to grab samples, which is, it's a little bit of research, and you've got a rope attached to a buoy that's moving up and down with the swell, and you've got currents, so it's not just moving up and down, it's moving backwards and forwards and side to side. So you've got to do some fairly clever prediction for navigation to actually grab it in the first place and pull it off. So that's been interesting, the challenges. But all our projects, and what enables us to work so far, is for all our projects we use simulators. So here's a hyper-realistic simulator of underwater. We've even published papers on how light reflects off plankton and so on. And every line of code that's running on the drone in the simulator is running line for line on the drone under the water. And we've even remoted into the university server, changed some code, checked that it worked on the simulator, dumped it down, and it worked perfectly on the drone in the field. So, we've put a lot of work into these simulators. It just accelerates our work so much doing that. Another area is, just to finish off, last slide, these scallops, which, unlike Europe, they hide themselves on the seabed by covering themselves with sand, really annoying. And so you can't see them, so we've come up with a way to actually see them and measure them really accurately. Because at the moment, the way they trawl them, they drag a big chain net on the seabed, completely destroy all the ecology, to the extent the government's actually shut down a whole lot of dredging everywhere for the scallops, and so we're developing a way to recognise them with a little robot arm, just picking up the ones that are the right size, leaving the other ones behind to protect the existing flora and fauna on the seabed. So again, constantly trying different network architectures to see what works the best. So thank you.